Next up is a panel that I've been looking forward to, and it's not just because it's one that I'm moderating. So this panel coming up next is themed, Can Regulation Keep Up in the Brave New World of Food? And it's going to be a good mix of history and the future ahead for technologies like genetic engineering and alternative proteins. So on this panel, I'm very excited to have Professor Jennifer Thomson, who is Emeritus Professor in the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology at the University of Cape Town. She has published 4 books on genetically modified organisms and won the L'Oreal UNESCO Prize for Women in Science for Africa in 2004. She is the president of the Organization for Women in Science for the Developing World. She is joined by Wilfred Feng, who joined Dentons' Shanghai office as senior counsel in 2019. His practice focuses on global food and drug, agricultural and environmental laws, advising clients in the sectors of food and biotechnology, amongst others. Before joining Dentons, Mr. Feng spent 14 years at Keller and Hickman, an international regulatory law firm, and prior to that, he worked at DuPont. Last but certainly not the least, we have Dr. Benjamin Smith, who is the director of the Future Ready Food Safety Hub and director of the Human Safety Platform at the Singapore Institute of Food and Biotechnology Innovation under the Agency for Science, Technology and Research in Singapore. Dr. Smith has worked across the industry, academia and government, and is a strong proponent of the importance of embedding safety across the entire food chain. Now, introducing myself, I'm Sin Yi Lim, Executive Director of Sustainability and Agricultural Impact at Pinduoduo, and I'll be the moderator for this panel. So as mentioned for the previous panel, if you have questions, pop it in the box to the right. We'll kick off first with a round of presentations from our experts before we open up for Q&A. So first up, we'll have Professor Thomson sharing with us some insights from her latest book, GM and the Global Divide, which actually looks back at how we have arrived at such disparate regimes for GM around the world and what lessons this experience may portend for gene editing looking ahead. Please go ahead, Professor Thomson.
GM Crops and the Global Divide is my latest book. This is what it looks like, which is showing good crops on the left and bad crops on the right. I originally called this book GM Crops, the West versus the Rest, but my publisher decided it was a little bit too confrontational, so it's moderated like this. So much of what I'm talking about today comes from my book. So the overview of my presentation, I'm first going to look at why countries took different stands on GM crops. And in that case, I will be looking at the West versus the rest. Secondly, why are there different regulations for food having different origins? So, for instance, GM crops versus mutagenesis. And then finally, I'll end off with some lessons from GMOs to help with genome editing. So let's look at the West in its attitudes. I often think that the attitude in the EU started a bit as a trade war because the original GM crops that were developed mainly by Monsanto were greatly accepted in the USA. And I think that Monsanto rather arrogantly thought that they could just grow them sell them and grow them in the EU and they would just accept it. And the EU perhaps didn't want to be flooded by GM crops that would outcompete maybe their own farmers. So that was the start of the whole pro and anti. Of course, antis help to sell newspaper because bad news, which they go in for, is grabs much more attention than good news. And then Greenpeace took an opportunity, and I'll come back to Greenpeace just now. There's a guy called Mark Linus in the UK who was a member of Greenpeace and used to go around putting fire to field trials. And then he actually read the science behind it. He actually read it in the AAAS in science from the American Science Organization. And he realized that he got it wrong. So he had a volte-face, which we call a turnaround. He wrote a book called Seeds of Science, Why We Got It So Wrong on GMOs. And I do recommend, if you're interested in their attitudes, to look at this, because he does give very good insight into how Greenpeace and other organizations operate. And we must remember that knowledge does not necessarily lead to acceptance. In many cases, it's the farmers and the consumers. And very often, of course, in Africa, the farmers are the consumers. So if they talk to their members of parliament and say, unless we can grow these, we're not going to vote for you, that talks a lot. And I used to go in the early days of GM crops quite often to Brussels to talk to the EU. And they admitted to me, and I'm sure they will admit it, that their decisions are not based on science. Their decisions are made on public acceptance and politics and things like that. And if we look at what the developed world says and the developing world perspective, in the developed world, they say we've got enough food. We don't need GM crops or food. And the world produces enough food anyway to feed its entire population, which is absolutely true, except that it doesn't always get to the right people. So in the developing world, we say we are desperately short of food and we need anything that can increase food availability. And we don't always have access to this food because we're too poor to get the trains and the road system going. So what has been a significant problem, as I will talk about in the African attitudes, is that the cost of regulation has become so extensive, and it's so expensive, that it prevents the development of GM local crops, such as cowpeas, which is very prevalent, very good nutrition in West Africa. But there's no Monsanto or other biotechnology company that's going to spend money on a local crop because it doesn't actually make money. So I've had experience of this in my own career, that I've not been able to bring to commercialization crops that we've been working on. So what is the EU influence on, and why does the EU have such a big influence on African crops, particularly in the acceptance of GM crops? Well, the leaders in Africa, they follow the European Union rather than the USA. So they follow the EU, which does not accept it, and they don't follow the USA. And why is that? It's because foreign aid from EU is much greater than from the US. The policymakers have closer ties with the EU. They often send their kids to university in Europe, and the agricultural exports go to the EU. So, and we must remember that the EU stand on this technology is based on risks, not benefits to consumers. That's a hugely important difference. And as I said earlier, African farmers are very often the same people as consumers because they're smallholder farmers and they feed their families and their neighbors from their little crops. And a big change came about in the EU after mad cow disease because it was realized that viruses can switch from animals to humans. And before that, a lot of EU farmers would feed their animals from offal from the abattoirs. As soon as they realized about mad cow disease, they couldn't do that. So how do they feed their animals? They feed them on plants. And what plants do they use? Soybeans and maize. But they can't grow them themselves because it's so dangerous. So they import it from America, from USA, from Argentina, from Brazil, and that's almost 100% GM. So would they allow their farmers to import these maize and soybeans to feed their animals, but they can't grow it themselves? Now, there is no logic in that. There is no science in that. I often quote these two scientists, Brooks and Barfoot, they're economists from the UK, that put out papers on global benefits, environmental impacts and things. And I strongly advise anybody who's interested in the economic aspects of this to look at the literature of Brooks and Barfoot. For instance, in 2016, the income benefits of GM crops of 18.2 billion, which added 5.4% to the global value of soybeans, maize, canola, and cotton. And 55% of farm income benefits were earned by farmers in developing countries. I'll show you that in a minute. I've got a slide showing that. And it's terribly important not to use more land. So allowing farmers to produce more without needing to use equivalent additional land is totally important. And Brooks and Barfoot reckon that without GM crops, the need to plant more land to take up non-GM crops would be equivalent to the combined areas of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So in this period of global warming, we cannot use more land to produce them. Now I'm getting back to the Greenpeace slide that I have here. And what they're saying in essence to this, I headed the danger of misinformation, but actually it's disinformation. Misinformation might just be by mistake. Disinformation is deliberately making mistakes. And here they are saying to these people, if you eat maize, GM maize, you will become sterile. Any GM food you eat, you will become sterile. Imagine saying that to men anywhere, and particularly in Africa. It just adds another layer of disinformation. And here I've taken the global area of biotech crops from 1996 to 2017. And you can see the total is the green line up at the top. And then the blue line is industrial countries, and the red line is developing countries. And you can see that the developing countries are starting to overtake in volume the amount of GM crops they grow. Because, for instance, Argentina and Brazil, they produce virtually 100% GM soybeans, so there's no room for expansion. But there is a huge amount of room for the developing world. So that's a very important aspect. And I was part of an article shown below by Bessler et al. When we looked at the costs of not using GM crops. And in Africa, it counted for $2.5 billion between that time, 2008 and 2013. In Australia, 380 million during that period. And in India, 200 million per year for golden rice. So we can see that by not using GM crops, you're actually making your country poorer. Now, we've dealt with why do countries take different stands and why are there different regulations with different origins. I've only got one slide on this, but I'm looking at mutagenesis. If any of you have been to a mutagenesis factory, if you like, they take the seeds and they bombard them either with radiation or with chemical mutagens. And you don't know what you've done to the genome. You might have created all sorts of nasty things in the genome. All you look for is the trait you're looking for, whether it's disease resistant or higher yields. And this is not regulated at all. And we don't know what it's done to the rest of the genome. So from 1930 to 2014, more than 3,200 varieties of mutagenized crops were released. And some examples are ruby grapefruit, a number of rice varieties in China, resistant to pests, high yield, salt tolerance, seedless fruit. And there is no regulation, except a little bit in Canada that sort of tends to look at mutagenized crops in the same way as GM crops. So is there any logic? There isn't any logic on regulating GM crops and not regulating crops that have been developed by mutagenesis. And then finally, what lessons from GMOs can we use to help with genome editing? And I've just got one slide on this. We have to realize that these have to be science-based regulations. They should not be too expensive because we need public institutions to develop improved crops. The emphasizing is on new crops developed locally, such as drought-tolerant maize in Africa with global warming coming on. We need public-private partnerships to bring crops to commercialization. Terribly important is communication. We have to have good communication with farmers, the public, regulators, and politicians to address their fears. And the only way we can address fears is to have good communication based on trust. The people we're communicating with need to trust us, and we have to be very, very aware of that. So some thoughts in communication. I hope you'll agree with me that the benefits outweigh any potential drawbacks. Most of the drawbacks have been of the use of GM crops, not the technology, but the overuse and getting monocrops and things like that, and herbicide-resistant crops. Success, importantly, is not instantaneous. We need government support for sensible regulations. We have to have regulations. They have to be sensible. We need government support for, oops, something has happened here. We need government support for research, because if you as a scientist know that what you are producing an insect-resistant cowpea is never going to see the light of day in your country, what incentive is there to do research? And so we also need public-private collaborations to get to commercialization. So thank you very much for listening.
Well, thanks, Professor Thomson. And now I'd like to hand it over to Wilfred, who will be setting the scene on regulatory approaches towards novel foods such as alternative proteins and how China is thinking about regulation in this space, which is certainly a very hot topic on a lot of people's minds. Over to you now, Wilfred.
Hi, everybody. In just the next 10 minutes or so, I'll talk about the novel food system. I focused on the situation in China, but first of all, I will set it in a global context. First of all, the regulatory needs were triggered by the growing demand for new proteins or the quantity of proteins. For instance, when the consumers, especially Asia, they are changing their diet pattern from eating more carbohydrate to more protein-rich food. In other words, meat. People just want to eat more meat, want to be more nutritious, want more tasty food. That will increase the general demand of the protein quantity. There is also very special demand for special proteins. For instance, for infant formula, people want some special proteins that may, in structure, more similar to those components in the mother breast milk, for instance, the human milk or the saccharides, all these things that trigger the continuing demand, a growing demand for more proteins and more special varieties of proteins. So when we talk about the new proteins, we actually have different solutions, and actually different countries or jurisdictions may have a different thought about these solutions. Of course, when in Europe, for instance, the people have the mindset to use more insect or the new varieties of insect to serve as the human food. That's a very unique way to satisfy the growing demand for proteins in Europe. But in the North America or in Israel, people have the different idea. For instance, they used more plant meat alternative to solve the problem. And in the next phase, they may use the biofermentation or cell-cultured meat as the solutions. There are also the possibilities that people use the bioengineered microorganism to enhance the performance of the yield or the quality performance of the existing crop. Next slide, please. Okay, now because this is the continuing growing demand for more proteins and the new proteins, there will be certain regulatory concerns. First of all, they may amount to the level they are new food ingredients or novel food ingredients that may be subject to pre-market clearance mechanisms in certain jurisdictions. They might also be plant and animal quarantine measures to be imposed on the new proteins. In most of the countries, be it the developing countries or the developed world, most of the compliance or the food schedules are not first discovered by the government authorities. They are turned in by either the consumer activists or NGOs or other types of informers like the whistleblowers, the insiders. I will not put too much emphasis on that. Next slide, please. Now, when we talk about the novel food, there are different type of regulatory scheme in the world. Certain countries or jurisdictions, they may have explicit pre-market clearance systems. For instance, in the United States, there is a mechanism called generally recognized as safe or GRAS. In that process, the business can make their self-determination about the GRAS status. Instead, if they want more confidence in themselves and want to assure their customers or the societies, they can also choose to file a GRAS notification with the US FDA and getting a blessing letter from USDA. So that is a mechanism, not in the name of a novel food, that is a de facto mechanism to obtain pre-market clearance for novel food ingredients. There are also certain countries or jurisdictions, they have explicitly a novel food system, for instance, China or the European Union or Canada or Australia and the New Zealand. And I think that Singapore is the latest addition to that list of countries or jurisdictions which have an explicit pre-market clearance system for novel food. There are also some other countries, for instance, Japan. Japan does not have a novel food system, nor a grass system either, but they have a very unique system. You can actually use it as a de facto novel food system to get the pre-market government blessing if you want to put something new onto the Japanese market. I would not elaborate the details here. That actually, in the world, most of the jurisdictions, they have a post-market surveillance system. They look at the regulatory approvals in other developing jurisdictions like EU or US or Japan, or sometimes in China or Singapore, to see whether they should permit something new on their own domestic market and conduct a post-market surveillance system. Next slide, please. Now, the next question is how new is new, or what makes a novel food or new food additives in China or in other jurisdictions? I focus on the specific situations in China first. In China, if something is determined as a new food ingredient, you simply look at the positive list for food additives. If a certain substance is not on that list, it will be considered as a new food additives. But for novel food ingredients, it's more complicated because there is no consolidated list for all existing foodstuff or food ingredients in China. You have to do your own research or talk to an expert in order to make your self-determination. The criteria spelled out in the regulation is that if something has already been consumed safely by Chinese consumers in at least one province for at least 30 years, that would not be considered as novel, or in other words, they'll be considered as a cleared or existing. It'll be considered as existing foodstuff or food ingredients. Well, if you use a certain bioengineering on certain products, be it the animals or plants, that basically that will make a novel food ingredients. Of course, the regulatory path to review and approve the genetic products derived from genetically modified organisms will be slightly different. I will talk about it a little bit later. Next slide, please. Okay, as I said, in order to determine whether something is new or novel, it has to be determined on a case-by-case basis. And the very likely you have looked at the details. For instance, if you extract something from existing foodstuff, whether that makes a new food ingredient or novel food, we cannot be too generalized. You have to look at the details. If you use water to extract something from the existing foodstuff, that will be considered as substantially equivalent to the existing one. That does not create the problem of a novel food. However, if you use certain chemical solvent or biochemical process to extract something from the existing foodstuff, they'll be considered the outcome. The product will be considered as new, as novel food ingredient that will be subject to pre-market clearance systems. Of course, then the next question is whether this novel food ingredient or new food additive is safe. Basically, you look at its source first, whether it's sourced or extracted from food source, existing foodstuff or non-food source. That will determine the different workload of further technical review. And you look at the process, how it's extracted, how it's generated from the existing stuff. And for genetically modified organisms or their derivatives, look at details. What are the donor gene? How is the process? The foreign gene is integrated into the genomes of the host, the organism, etc. And you look at the genetic stability of the outcome, organism, etc. There will also be other considerations, among other things, the international clearance status. So far, in China, the Chinese government has never been willing to be the first jurisdiction in the world to prove something new for food users. They always look at the European Union approvals, US FDA approvals, and I think the European Union approval will bear more weight among the mindset of the Chinese policymakers or regulators. And the last thing is basically European concept. You still look at the socio-economic assessment to determine whether something new is absolutely necessary from the social and the economic standpoint. Next slide, please. Okay. If you look at the overall mechanism, first of all, in most jurisdictions, there will be administrative procedures, of course, that predetermine how long it will take to get clearance for a novel food ingredient. It varies. In the European Union, it takes at least 2 years to get the novel food approval. The technical review process by EFSA, the European Food Safety Agency, takes probably 6 or 9 months. But the follow-on administrative procedure to get a signatory from all member states will take 12 or sometimes 18 months. So at least for the planning purpose, the approval process in Europe will take at least 2 years. In China, I think it's close to the 1 to 2 years to get a novel food ingredient cleared by the authorities. Of course, if it's not involved in genetically modified technology. Otherwise, that it may invite dual agency approvals, meaning you need to get the approval from 2 ministries. That will take much longer time. It's in Japan, it can also be quite slow. In United States, it's quicker. The notification process may be accomplished in a matter of, let's say, 9 or 12 months. That's possible, of course, depending on how difficult and the details of the technology and the products. Okay, for the safety standpoint, first of all, and I think the most important thing is about the toxicological studies to prove something is safe to animals, so to conclude that will be safe to human beings as well. For genetically modified organisms, there will be an additional aspect to look at, for instance, the nutrient and the anti-nutrient profile. For instance, the natural soybean may naturally contain certain anti-nutrients, trypsin inhibitor, phytates, etc. So you want to make sure if it's a genetically modified soybean, its anti-nutrient level will not be higher than its conventional counterpart, etc. Of course, these days you have to look at whether there is any tendency the new product will be a human allergen. When we talk about, especially when we talk about the cell cultured meats, the alternative solutions, naturally there will be a question about whether the use of a stem cell will cause the human carcinogen, and there will be a detailed look at that. And for genetically modified products, there will be a need to look at its impact on the environment, biodiversity, from other things. Like I said, there will be a socio-economic considerations as well to make sure such new technology and products are absolutely needed in China or in Europe. In US, there is no such so-called socio-economic considerations. It's purely based on the technology. Next slide, please. So it's almost my last slide to have a few words about the regulation about something new, so-called cell cultured meat alternative products. What's unique about the cell cultured meat is that so far there is no clear idea which agency should regulate In the United States, there is a joint agreement between the US FDA and the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, to split their work. But that model will not be useful or of a good reference to China, to any other jurisdictions, because dividing the jurisdiction between USDA and FDA is quite different from the one dividing the agriculture authorities and the health authorities in China, in Japan, or in Europe. They'll be quite different. So it's a pending question to other countries to determine which country or which agent or which agencies will together to regulate the cell culture meat products. And how to conduct the risk assessment for cell culture meat products are still pending the issues, because not of the details the people need to talk about. I don't think there has already been a consensus formed yet. It takes time to form that consensus, not to mention to be commonly accepted or actually practiced globally. And there will also be a certain, not just the food safety, but also fair trade considerations. For instance, whether the alternative product can be called meat. And I guess the devils are in the details. In different contexts of the language, there will be different conclusions. They may be more arguable in the Western languages whether this alternative product can be called meat. But in most of the East Asian languages, I don't think there's a problem, because the meaning of the scope of a meat or dairy in most of Asian languages are much broader than those in Roman letter or Slavian letter-based language. I would not elaborate on these details too much. Next slide, please. Okay. I finished my presentation. Thank you for your patience.
Well, thanks, Wilfred, for that very comprehensive scoping. So up next, we'll have Dr. Smith, who will share with us the view from Singapore and how the regulators there in Singapore became the first in the world to approve the sale of cultivated meat. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, everyone, for giving me this opportunity. And I always like being the last speaker, because typically all of the intelligent things have already been said, and I can just say refer to Wilfred or Professor Thomson. Okay, so I'm not going to belabor this, but I think many people on the call, particularly those working in the novel protein space and cellular meat space, know that when it comes to innovation, a key aspect of moving these new products and ideas forward is making sure that we hit the right part of the innovation curve and get in at the right time. And there's this common concept known as jumping the curve with new technologies, and making sure that we hit the right point when it comes to innovation. However, when we're linking, if we go to the next slide, innovation with regulation, one of the problems we have is this concept called the pacing problem, where often the technology and the ideas and these great new ideas to combat food security and food nutrition and safety and all of these sorts of areas often more forward or further forward on the curve than the regulatory change, particularly in countries like the US, where regulatory change requires a lot of legislative action behind it. This is actually one of the unique things about Singapore as well, where and one of the reasons why we were the first country to bring cultured meats or clean meats to the market, because of the way that the regulatory structure works and works in tandem with trying to understand the new technologies and move them forward. So if we can go to the next slide, please. There are a lot of global challenges, as we heard from Wilfred, in bringing forward novel proteins to market. Many of them are regulatory and safety based, trying to understand what to do next. And it's not so much not knowing, but in many cases linking what we have to do with the regulations. And as I said, having a lack of changing attitudes, of course, towards food safety, and having a lack of standards and harmonization. So at the moment, a lot of countries are doing their own thing in this space, trying to figure out what to do. And of course, that also makes it hard when we're talking about the global food supply chain, because companies aren't just wanting, of course, to launch in Singapore, they're wanting to launch in China, South Africa, Australia, European Union, wherever. Next slide, please. So what is really key when we're trying to build in regulation and safety testing is making sure that we link the regulatory science with the regulatory approval and regulatory awareness. And a big part of that is making sure that with these new technologies like the clean meats, that the science being developed is discussed with the regulators and shared with the regulators, and we have this two-way talk. We bring in all of the experts, we bring in the people that know what they're talking about, and we discuss together. And I think Professor Thomson will be able to clarify better than I, but this was also one of the reasons, or one of the issues a little bit with the GM, I think, in that there wasn't a lot, particularly in Europe, a lot of interest to have that crosstalk or do it in the right way. Next slide, please. So what I have really been trying to push, and one of the things that I think is key, and we're seeing here in Singapore, is very much getting this idea across that when it comes to new innovations of food, that we need to embrace this idea of safety by design and start building in the regulatory process more as an aid to getting products to market, rather than what I'm used to coming from industry before I came to Singapore, as the regulatory function being a gate, saying you can't do something, you can't bring this onto market because of. Instead, and this is where Singapore have really taken a lot of steps, is that they've said, how do we actually take these products forward? How can we work to solve the food solution and make sure that we're bringing new products to market that are safe? Next slide, please. So I'm going to jump quickly through. This is just a slide on definitions. I don't know if the slides will be shared after, but these are the Singapore definitions, and Wilfred sort of mentioned some of these aspects before, particularly the concept of novel foods being foods that haven't been in the diet or eaten before. But you can see the link here as well to the principles from the Singapore government with regard to the safety assessment of novel foods. But novel foods really include both foods and ingredients, and things that haven't been typically eaten in the diet. And in the case of Singapore, they put the 20-year time period there. A few other countries have a slightly different time period, and some other countries make it specific as to 20 years in their region, whereas Singapore doesn't do that. Next slide, please. So you can actually look across the different food regulations, and again, Wilfred spoke about this, so I won't belabor it. But at the moment, there are no standardized novel food regulations across the market, across the world, but there is a lot of similarity with how the safety scientists are looking at it. We all generally agree that the types of approaches that we've used for food additives and also for GM crops and things can be applied. And in Singapore at the moment, we have a hybrid model where that is evolving more towards a sort of a grass-based approach. But in all cases, the emphasis is on the suppliers or the company putting the product on the market to do the safety testing and to assure the due diligence. And at the moment, it's still very much a case-by-case approach, even here in Singapore, where we're looking at a number of products and things coming on the market, novel foods. Next slide, please. So what do we need to know about the safety of food ingredients? And Wilfred touched on this, and he spoke about the GRASS approach and substantive equivalence, and the EFSA approach and some of the timelines there. And there are some links here that people can check out, but I think I'll jump to the next slide because of time and really focus a little bit more in on what Singapore are doing. And effectively, Singapore have put together their guidance when it comes to the food safety for novel foods. It's available on the SFA website, and so I recommend that anyone interested check it out. What it does is it gives you a guideline of the key sorts of endpoints and safety considerations to take into account. But what I would like to point out, and it's a common thing for food safety and novel food and also food additive assessments, is that really a key factor with many of these processes is understanding composition, really showing what you've got. And a lot of that leads very much to understanding this idea of substantive equivalence. So when it comes to cellular meats, obviously the composition aspect is the proteins of the cellular meats, which we could argue are very much the same as what you're getting in the animal. But then, of course, there are other components like the cell media that are used that need to be considered, the scaffolds that are used, many of which are plant proteins, so soy and wheat based, so maybe introducing things like allergens that you wouldn't normally have in a piece of meat, these sorts of things that need to be considered that are a little bit different. And then there are more the standard toxicological aspects and the characterization of things like digestion and safety testing. Next slide, please. So really what I try and tell people about all of these types of approaches is that it's really focused on understanding your risk assessment and understanding the both the process, the components, and then the anticipated exposure. So all of these regulators will put out different types of testing, but bottom line is, how do you put that data together to really say what is safe, and how does the risk assessor come out with their qualified assessment? Next slide, please. So this is just a closer look at novel foods and proteins. Typically, when we're talking about novel proteins, we're talking about, as we said, history of safe use. And the key areas are things like allergenicity. With a new protein, we're very much concerned with, could this protein cause an allergenic response in an individual? And also, how is this novel protein digested? What is its stability? And that leads a little bit in part to whether it can be actually a qualified allergen or not, or potentially a toxin. Next slide, please. One of the things, though, that I will point out when we're talking about novel proteins that is a little bit different compared to, say, maybe chemicals and additives, is that when you're thinking about proteins, we are very much thinking about this concept of allergenicity, and where that differs from general chemical additives is that when we're talking about a distinct small molecule chemical entity, the toxicity is very much linked to the structure and the inherent properties of that material. When we're talking about a protein, it gets a little bit more complex, and particularly novel proteins that we're modifying, whether they're recombinant human proteins that we're putting tags on, or there are even things like just standard animal proteins. How we modify them and change them can have an effect, but equally the organism that's being exposed plays a key role here. And when it comes to immunogenicity and allergenicity, we have to take that into account. And so when we start to look at novel foods and understand novel foods being brought to the market, a whole lot of other questions are starting to also be raised that we have to address. And so a good example, insect proteins, which are novel in many countries, and understanding, could these new insect proteins be allergens, but equally, could they be cross-allergens to things like shellfish? So insects are closely related phylogenetically to shellfish, and they have some links with cross-reactivity. And in a country like Singapore, we actually have a high prevalence rate of allergenicity to dust house mite through inhalation. So from a food safety aspect, could some of these insect proteins be an issue? When it comes to cellular meats, of course, we're talking about standard proteins from the animal, so it tends to be less of an issue. We know about chicken and its potential for allergenicity. We know about beef and those sorts of things. Next slide, please. So there is information out there. This is just a reference for guidance on allergenicity and toxicity from Codex and EFSA. And so there's quite a bit of information out there. This is pointing you to it. But for those of you who are interested, I'm more than happy if you send me an email to provide information and help navigating some of this space, particularly with respect to Singapore. Next slide, please. And really what is key, as I tried to say from the beginning, is not just looking at these guidances and saying, I have to do this test or I have to do that test, but rather looking at how we can put the data together in a qualified risk assessment. And that's one of the things that we've been doing here in Singapore, both at A*STAR, but also with respect to the SFA and the process of assessment, where we've actually been taking different types of new approaches from bioinformatics through digestion and risk assessment, and putting it all together to do the qualified safety assessment. Okay, I think next slide is my last slide. If we could go to that. So I'd just like to end off, as mentioned at the beginning, I am working in this new initiative of the Future Ready Food Safety Hub here in Singapore, which is a tripartite organization between A*STAR, Singapore Food Agency, and home based at NTU. And we have been working on a lot of the cellular and clean meats and working on these processes. And we're keen to help out anyone interested in bringing new products and new ideas to Singapore, particularly if they're going to help us with our food security needs for the future. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben, for that very detailed explanation. I think, what all three of you in your presentation, what it has really shown is actually when it comes to food, there's really a very complex web, right, that's involved, because you're not just thinking about, okay, the thing itself, but, in the example of GMOs, right, how actually cross-border trade and aid plays a very important role in influencing the development of another region. And then, like Ben was explaining earlier, it never occurred to me that, shellfish and insects, in terms of allergenicity, there could be a correlation there as well. So there's really quite a lot of things that I think for regulators, as they move forward with dealing with novel foods, they have to weigh and evaluate. So for the Q&A, we've got some great questions that have come in. I want to kick off first with a question to Professor Thomson, on the role of communication, because I think what you made clear in the history of kind of how GMOs were perceived and treated is that communication is really important to get consumer buy-in, right, which you need for commercial viability. So would there be any successful examples that you might point us to? No, Prof. Thomson, sorry, we still can't quite hear you. Perhaps while you get the audio sorted out, I'm actually also going to turn it over to Wilfred and Ben on a similar topic. So we actually have a question that came in from a member of the audience, Chung Yen Leong, and he was commenting about the lack of science in consumer perception. Right. So, for instance, on GMO, there's a fair bit of ignorance. Do you think, to anyone who would like to answer, with the emergence of the mRNA COVID vaccine, are people's attitudes towards new technologies or, genetic engineering technologies shifting?
Yeah, I think that it's also a very much a cultural and regional thing as well, where you see these attitudes changing, and a lot depends on the consumer confidence and trust, I think, in their regulators. Here in Singapore, we have a very strong trust in our regulatory system, and the consumers tend to be confident that the right things are being done to bring new products to market. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm and interest to see. I think that but a key part of that, to your point, is having the right communication aspects in there and ensuring that people really understand what some of these new technologies are. So taking an example that we've been seeing here in Singapore, we're doing, in addition to cell meats and other things, a lot of attention is being put to fermentation products and biotech. And everyone's starting to say, oh, biotech, it's new. Well, no, it's not. We've been fermenting products for years, particularly here in Asia, Southeast Asia. And so that's an education aspect. It's getting people to talk about it and really understand. And I think that that's where the scientists developing these technologies really have to take a key role in not just getting the data together or the information for the regulators or for their own companies, but also very much thinking how the consumers are going to perceive that and take it forward. And GM is the classic example there, where communication has in some cases gone the right way, but in many cases gone the wrong way. Golden rice is a classic example there, and it led to a whole lot of problems.
Thanks, Ben. Wilfred, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, I think that is a very interesting question, and I think the communication and education are extremely important. I do not think the consumers are afraid of new things. It's really whether they can see any value to them. For instance, just give an example. In GMO is considered something very bad, negative new things. But on the other hand, where there are nanotechnology, where in Chinese market we see something has been claimed as nanotechnology, or even something claimed as quantum technology, which does not exist actually. So these things will be used as a tag enable to consumers if they consider that is something of good value to them, whether it's real or perceived. So the communication is very, very important. And the average consumers, if they're not stupid, they can be very easily led or misled.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points. I think we have Professor Thomson back on with us. Hope your audio is working now. No, unfortunately, still can't hear you. In the meantime, I'm going to go with another audience question to both Ben and Wilfred. There's a question that has come in from Kathleen Slingerland, who says, I see Codex as a challenge when expanding the novel foods market. How do you suggest that countries and NGOs address novel foods at the Codex level?
Well, maybe I take first. For novel food regulations, as Ben pointed out, there has been no internationally standardized approach. Food additive, there is one. There is a joint expert committee from the WHO and the FAO. But unfortunately, for novel food ingredients, I don't think it has been very well harmonized globally. Of course, that's the direction to go, which people should advocate. But realistically, I don't know how mature the global harmonization for novel food regulations will be accomplished.
Yeah, I think when it comes to global standards and voluntary standards like Codex, it's a challenge across the board, not just for novel foods, but in the initial stage, the regions and the countries themselves have to decide what is safe for their population and get that on place. And where I actually think in this novel food space, we are actually seeing a lot of crosstalk. We're seeing forums like this where people from China, South Africa, and Singapore are talking. I was on one the other day where we had the FDA and EFSA chatting about these things. Singapore and Food Standards Australia and New Zealand are swapping discussions about what we're doing on novel food. So I'm actually quite confident that if we can keep that discussion going between the agencies and get the alignment within the countries, that then when you go to Codex, which is the consensus and everyone bringing things to the table, that it may actually be easier than we think. It's not going to be immediate, it's going to take some time, but in this space, there's quite a lot of people committed. Particularly because of the innovation field really pushing things forward. And countries are looking to each other to share information in this space. So fingers crossed that it actually moves quicker than we think it, and we've seen in the past with Codex.
Yeah, I think it's certainly encouraging that, you are starting to see more of the regulators talk to each other. And I think, as shared earlier, there is also the precedence of, people will look at kind of the considerations or what was approved or what was the framework taken in a particular country, and then think about how that might apply in their own country. So I'm just curious in terms of that formulation process. So certainly regulators are talking to each other, but are you seeing the regulators talking to other stakeholders? So are there, for instance, any kind of planned consumer consultations, or perhaps involving universities or research institutes in that process?
I don't want to. Does anyone else want to jump in? I can jump in quickly. I don't want to grab all the mic time. Here in Singapore, we're definitely doing that, and that's one of the platforms that Fresh is really focused on, is to bring the discussion together. And I think it's also one of the reasons why the Just Chicken got through in Singapore, because the Singapore Food Agency is actively trying to reach out and discuss with and understand the industry and what's being done. Obviously, they need to, with all regulators, you need to keep a certain separation of church and state, but you also need to make sure that the people doing these assessments understand the new technology and understand what's happening. And that's often the bottleneck, because a lot of this new technology is being done by the scientists in the lab that are really breaking the barrier when it comes to innovation. And the regulators and people like myself, the risk assessors, we're not that forward as scientists. We take a little bit longer to understand what we're doing. And so I think that bringing the two together really helps to move that forward. So discussion is key. On the consumer side, it sort of touched on your earlier question of communication, but there are a lot of initiatives to get consumers out there, and a lot of groups like GFI and others that are trying to do that and bring in the regulators into that discussion as well.
Yes, I will also echo Dr. Smith's point here. I think that Singapore has done a very good job in terms of public consultation before something new or something important is imposed. Particularly in China, we think there is a significant improvement in the past 20 years. Let's say 20 years ago, when the policymakers launched the new regulation, there is no public consultation. There is no even a grace period. But here today, we see the policymakers and excuse me, regulators are doing a better work today in China. Another point I want to raise is that when we talk about the public consultation, it may also inevitably involve certain noises, because the regulations are supposed to be science-based. But in the public consultation process, very often it may involve the non-scientific noises. It's a delicate line how to balance these two parts.
Great. I think that was a very good roundup of kind of what we have seen in the past, as with the GM debate. And I'm going to give it one last try. Professor Thomson, do you think your audio? Oh gosh, well, I'm really sorry about that. So unfortunately, we're at time. So I'm sorry we were not able to get your audio working to handle the Q&A. But thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you all of you for listening in to this panel. It was certainly a very educational one for me, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And with that, I'll close off this panel and we'll go to the next one on nutrition.